British colonization of India. Man, people get fired up about this one, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a sensitive topic.
Definitely sensitive. You've got those who see it as just straight up exploitation, and then others who are like, no, but it brought progress.
Right. Like, who are we supposed to believe?
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to cut through all those super strong opinions.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Really look at the facts and data together.
Facts and data. I like it.
Yeah. And our main source, his name is Kartik Gada. He's American, but has Indian heritage.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so his perspective is, well, pretty unique, maybe even a little less biased,
I'll be. Yeah.
I'll be looking at, the good and the bad. But most importantly, we're going to explore this question. Can India's economic situation today really be blamed on something that happened 74 years ago?
That's a big one.
It is a big one.
To what extent does the past, dictate the present, right?
Exactly. So let's do a super quick history lesson here. You might be surprised to learn that the British, they were actually late to the whole colonization game in India.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
The Portuguese, the French, Dutch, even the Danish, they all had, footholds in India before the Brits even showed up.
Wow. So the British were playing catch-up.
Totally. And it's like this classic latecomer advantage thing.
Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. We see that pattern a lot in history.
Right.
Think North America,
Oh, yeah.
Australia, even parts of Africa.
Yeah.
The British, they weren't the first ones there, but they often ended up running the show.
Yeah.
Makes you think, did that same thing happen in India?
It really does. And Kartik, he uses this super cool historical map animation to show how it all happened, how it all went down. You see this maroon color.
Maroon. Okay.
It represents British control, and it's slowly, spreading across India like a wave. It takes, almost 2 centuries.
Wow.
Wild.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a long time. 2 centuries of, dramatic power shifts.
Right. And it really makes you think about, the lasting impact of all that change on the region.
For sure.
Okay, so let's get into the economics of it all.
Okay, yeah. Money talks.
Right. And there's no denying that. Resource extraction, that was a major, major part of British colonization in India.
Of course.
But here's where it gets interesting. Kartik argues that the people who are living in Britain today, they weren't necessarily the ones who, benefited most from all that wealth.
Interesting. So where did all that wealth go?
Well, he points to Australia. Think about it. Australia, it was being settled by people from Britain at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the resources that were coming out of India, they were actually being used to build up Australia.
Wow. So it's not as simple as saying Britain got rich off India.
Yeah.
It's more complicated than that.
Way more complicated. It's like these historical actions, they have these ripple effects.
Yeah. And they affect different generations and different continents in all these crazy ways.
Yeah. And it makes you think about global history as this massive web of interconnected events.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now to get, the other side of this whole argument.
Okay, sure.
We've got Shashi Tharoor. He's an Indian politician who gave this killer speech a few years back at the Oxford Union.
I might have seen that. It went viral, right?
It's super viral.
Yeah, something about how Britain destroyed the Indian economy.
Yeah, and he uses this really powerful statistic.
What's that?
India, they went from controlling 25% of the global economy in 1750 to, get this, a measly 2% by 1947 when they got their independence.
That's a huge drop.
It's massive.
Of course, you always got to be careful with historical economic data. I mean, it's not always a perfect comparison across, different eras.
Sure.
But that kind of decline during British rule, come on, that's hard to ignore.
No, it's impossible to ignore.
Right.
But now, get this. Kartik actually lays out what he sees as some good impacts of British colonization.
Good impacts. Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
I know, right? And some of this might come as a surprise.
All right, lay it on me.
He talks about how the English language, it's been incredibly beneficial for Indians today.
In what way?
Well, it's opened up all these possibilities. Global communication, education, even economic opportunities, right?
Yeah.
He also argues that British rule actually helped weaken the caste system, which had been, so deeply rooted in Indian society for centuries.
That's a controversial one. I mean, the caste system is super complex, and its impact is still being debated today.
Oh, absolutely.
It really makes you think, can these potential benefits, even if we acknowledge them, can they really outweigh the negative stuff?
Right. Like, is that even possible? And here's, like, maybe the most controversial thing he says. Kartik suggests that British colonization, it might have actually been less harmful compared to what could have happened if, say, the Portuguese or French had ended up in control.
Whoa. Okay, that's a wild thought experiment. It makes you think about all these historical what-ifs, right? Like,
Yeah.
how would India have been different?
Exactly.
It also shows just how important it is to, look at historical events within their specific context. You can't just, like, make blanket judgments.
No, you can't.
It's all about nuance.
Nuance, exactly. But Kartik's most, like, provocative argument, it's that it's time for India to stop blaming Britain for its current economic situation.
He's saying it's time to move on.
Basically, he says it's an outdated excuse at this point. He even has data showing that India's per capita GDP growth has lagged behind the rest of the world, even 74 years after independence.
That is a really good point. And when you look at economic charts that use a logarithmic scale, which, by the way, helps us see growth rates more accurately, it's clear that India's economic growth, while it's there, it hasn't been enough to close the gap.
And to really hammer that point home, Kartik makes these crazy comparisons.
Okay, like what?
He looks at Japan, after World War II.
Yeah.
They had to completely rebuild their entire country.
Total devastation.
Right. And then there's Vietnam. They actually surpassed India in economic development, even though they went through decades of war and chaos after India was already independent.
So he's not trying to say that what happened to India under British rule wasn't bad, right?
No, not at all. He's just challenging this idea that, like, colonization is the only thing holding India back today.
He's pushing for a more complex understanding.
Exactly.
There are a lot of factors at play.
Right. And then he throws in this final twist, which I thought was pretty ironic.
Tell me.
It's about remittances, the money people send back home when they're working abroad.
Yeah.
India, they get the most remittances of any country in the world.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
And Kartik, he connects this directly back to the widespread English language skills in India,
Which came from
British colonization.
So the system that was originally designed to, like, take wealth from India is now, in a weird way, helping to bring some of it back.
It's crazy how history works sometimes.
It really is. These
Yeah.
totally unexpected outcomes. It makes you wonder,
It really does. It really is. It makes you think about how interconnected, like, everything is,
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we've been talking about the historical context and all the economic arguments.
Right.
But what about, like, the social and cultural side of all this? The British brought their laws, their education system,
Yeah.
their whole way of thinking about society.
Yeah.
How much of that stuff is still shaping India today?
That is a great question. And it's something that historians are still trying to, like, wrap their heads around.
Yeah.
You have to remember, culture, it's always evolving. It's absorbing new influences, but it's also holding on to traditions.
Right.
It's not like a simple cause and effect situation.
It's messy. So where do we see, like, the most obvious British influence in India today?
Well, I mean, the English language.
Yeah.
It's probably the most enduring legacy.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
It's become the global language for, like, business and communication.
Right.
And India being fluent in English, it's definitely opened doors. Trade, education, technology.
Yeah, and it makes you think about, like, all those international companies that have set up shop in India.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier to do business when everyone's speaking the same language.
For sure.
That reminds me of something Kartik said. He mentioned that Indian Americans, they're some of the most successful ethnic groups in the U.S., income-wise.
Yeah, that's true.
And he credits a lot of that to their English skills. They're able to integrate quickly and compete in professional fields.
It's interesting, right? It's something that was, like, imposed on them by colonizers. It becomes this tool for upward mobility and success. Of course, it's not a guarantee or anything, but it levels the playing field in a lot of ways.
Definitely. And what about the legal system? India's legal framework, it's based on common law, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a direct inheritance from the British system, with its emphasis on precedent and an independent judiciary. Whether that's a good thing or not, that's up for debate. Some people argue that it's brought stability and fairness to India. It's a really diverse country.
Of course.
But others say it's too rooted in the colonial past. Like, it doesn't really address the needs of modern India.
Right. It's crazy to think about, like, all these systems that were designed, in a completely different time and place, and they're still functioning in India today.
Yeah. It makes you think, do they need to be adapted? reformed.
To better fit India's needs now.
Exactly.
These are some big questions India is wrestling with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that decolonization, it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
It's this ongoing process. It's not just about getting political independence. It's about, like, reclaiming and reshaping your own cultural and institutional structures.
It's about figuring out who you are. So we've explored, the good and the bad, the complexities.
Yeah.
But what's Kartik's final take on this whole blame game about India's economy?
Well, his stance is pretty clear. It's time for India to move on from blaming Britain for its economic problems today. He recognizes the harm that colonization caused, but he thinks that dwelling on the past prevents India from taking responsibility for its present and its future.
He really makes that point with those comparisons, like to Japan and Vietnam, right? Countries that went through some crazy challenges and still managed to, achieve incredible growth.
Yeah. He's basically saying, look, other nations have overcome historical adversity.
Right.
Why can't India? It's like a call to action.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Look inward, figure out what's really holding you back.
That's a bold statement.
It is. I bet it sparked a lot of debate.
I'm sure it has, but that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, right? It's not just about, easy answers.
Yeah.
It's about thinking critically about these complicated issues.
Challenging our assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to that big question we started with, does British colonization still hold India back? Kartik's answer is a pretty clear no.
He's saying it's time to stop using it as a scapegoat.
Exactly. And focus on the choices that India is making today.
Which brings us to the question of, what can India learn from this experience?
Right.
And how can those lessons, apply to you in your own life?
What do you think are some of the key takeaways here? Especially for someone, who's interested in learning from history.
Well, one thing that stands out to me is the importance of self-reliance. Colonization, by its very nature, it creates dependency.
Right.
One nation takes resources, controls the destiny of another. India's journey since independence, it's all about taking back that control.
Yeah.
Building its own institutions, its own economy, forging its own path. And that's something we can all apply to our own lives, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
The idea of taking ownership of your own destiny,
Yeah.
not letting external forces control you.
Mm.
Be your own person.
Right. But that journey toward self-reliance, it hasn't been easy.
Of course not. There have been challenges.
Yeah.
We see that in the economic data. But there's also been incredible progress. India is a major player in the world today.
Oh, yeah.
A rising economic power, a vibrant democracy. It's a nation that's constantly evolving,
Learning and adapting.
Exactly.
So maybe that's the biggest takeaway. This isn't just a story about India's past. It's a story about its present and its future. A story about resilience.
Transformation.
And a nation that's forging its own way forward.
And it's a story that goes way beyond India's borders. It speaks to this broader human experience of overcoming adversity, learning from what's happened, and shaping our own destinies, individually and collectively.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, the historical context, the economic arguments, the cultural impacts.
Even that whole thing with remittances.
Right. As we wrap up this part, what stands out to you as the most important insight? What's the one thought you're going to be thinking about?
For me, it's this realization that history, it's not static. It's not this fixed thing.
Yeah.
It's a living narrative that we're constantly, reinterpreting and reshaping.
Makes sense.
The way we see British colonization of India today, it's different from how people saw it 50 years ago. And it'll probably be seen differently 50 years from now.
Mm.
And that evolution, that change in perspective, it's crucial.
It's that saying, you can't understand the present without knowing the past, but you can't live in the past either.
Right. It's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. Learning, but not being stuck.
And with India, that balance is super important.
Yeah.
What are the biggest takeaways for India, and maybe even for you listening, is that self-reliance thing.
Oh, yeah. You were talking about that before.
Yeah, because colonization, it automatically creates dependency. One country controls everything.
Resources, the other country's future, the whole deal.
Right. So India's whole journey since independence, it's been about grabbing that power back.
Building your own stuff?
Exactly. Their own economy, institutions, their own identity, resilience and transformation all in one.
Makes me think about what Kartik said about getting past the blame game. It's not about forgetting, but realizing India has choices now.
They're in control of their own story now.
And that story is crazy interesting, all the challenges, and yet here they are.
Major player on the world stage. rising economic power, a democracy, which isn't easy. There's so much potential still.
And we didn't even get into the culture much, but think about all the art, literature, music that's come from this mix of old and new in India.
It's incredibly rich and so diverse. It's another kind of legacy, if you think about it.
How so?
Well, it shows how India takes things in, adapts, they create something totally new and amazing.
So, wrapping up our deep dive on this whole British colonization thing, what's sticking with you the most? What's the one idea you'll keep thinking about?
For me, it's that history isn't fixed, It's always changing how we see it.
Yeah.
The way we understand the past, it changes the present, maybe even the choices we make later on. Got to stay curious, ask questions, and be open to different views.
That is so important. And honestly, that's what makes these deep dives so cool. It's not about easy answers or picking a side.
Right, it's way more than that.
It's figuring out the complexity, understanding more, maybe even questioning our own ideas.
Love that. It's like embracing the messiness of history,
Mhm.
realizing there's not just one truth.
Well said. Thanks for being on this deep dive with me. I hope it gave everyone some stuff to think about, maybe even go explore this part of history more on their own.